Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Evropy or of Europe. There will be few people who would say that legal codes are easy to understand and comprehensive. Even less people will be willing to read them before the bedtime. The same problem exists with the EU legal code, and perhaps the problem is even worse because EU law combines the different legal cultures of its member states. The EU is trying to tackle this problem through the better lawmaking and better regulation policies, and we have special guest on this topic. I'm very pleased to introduce you Professor Helen Xanthaki. Welcome, Helen.
Hello, nice to be here.
Professor Xanthaki is Professor of Law at the UCL and Dean of Postgraduate Program at the University of London. She's also a member of the Committee for the Scrutiny of Legislative Process at the Presidency of Hellenic Government. Additionally, below the episode, you can find her study on the one in and one out policy for the European Parliament. My first question is a simple one, hopefully. Could you please explain our listeners what is the Better Regulation Initiative? Is it something new, something we never heard yet, or it's something which is staying with us for a longer time?
So, of course, the question is not easy. I think it is one of the most difficult questions one can ask.
There's a
The
reason why I have
easy,
expert here.
I don't think I don't think you can be an expert on better regulation, but here we are. So the easy answer would be that better regulation is an initiative launched by the European Commission back in 2010. So that's about 14 years ago, to address the issue of bad regulation and bad legislation within the European Union. So better regulation is an initiative that looks at the whole life cycle of regulation in the EU, from the moment when there is an idea for regulation to the decision and that the institutions will take as to how to regulate, and ultimately legislation and post-legislative scrutiny. And although this sounds quite grand, I must say that the European Commission and the European Union in general have done a wonderful job in addressing issues that back then were not widely identified as worth researching. For example, post-legislative scrutiny has come from the EU, and of course the EU is a model for better regulation. The difficulty, of course, is that the elements of better regulation are so many that the EU has focused only on pre and post legislative scrutiny and has not looked at legislation as such. So it's a really, really good initiative, one certainly worth following, but it has not gone far enough. And now, after the departure of Frans Timmermans from the head of better regulation, I doubt that it will go much further unless there's somebody else to champion the initiative.
Should we actually care about better regulation? Because it's just a regulation, it's just a law. It's something politicians are making some trades between each other and somebody put it on paper. So is it something ordinary citizens should take care of, or it's something? Yeah, that's the question.
This is another difficult question. Michal, you have
I'm
this
sorry.
way of asking very difficult questions. Should we care? Yeah, of course we should care. We should care on a number of grounds. First of all, the regulation and the whole regulation cycle ends up with the imposition of obligations on us, as in, private individuals or companies or whatever. So we do care because the end of the whole process will fall on our shoulders. We'll be asked to do stuff, or we may be offered rights that we need to know how to exercise. The question is whether we should care at the EU level or not, because until now, the prevalent view was it's okay, what happens in Brussels happens in Brussels. Our national governments will sort it out. So we would care more about what our national governments produce by way of regulation and legislation rather than the EU. But of course, we know that this is now a fallacy in the sense that our own administrations and our own parliaments basically copy what is happening in Brussels. Um, and also, they have no discretion as to whether to implement it or not. So, yes, we should care.
Because that's one of the, I don't know how to call it, let's say something we can hear from our ministers and our MPs, that it's this is something what the Brussels wants, and we are
Oh,
obliged to do that, so we cannot do anything about it. Is that true?
it isn't really, because Brussels is not, okay, it tends to be further away from our capitals, but at the end of the day, what Brussels wants and what Brussels decides is what our governments collectively agree to do. So, what I would say is this: Brussels does not regulate and does not legislate on its own. Having said that, the way the EU works right now, a country or a jurisdiction may well be in the minority and still have to comply, but not that often. Not that often.
Mhm. Uh, is it possible to me as a, let's say, ordinary citizens can take part in the process of better regulation?
That's another very, very good question and very difficult. And it tackles on the role of the citizen in the
Mhm.
communication between the EU and citizens. And I think you agree with me. I think we all agree that there isn't a direct channel of communication. The easy answer to that would be to say, oh, yes, of course you can. Whenever there's a consultation on regulation or legislation, you can always go online, go through the labyrinth of EU documents and EU jargon, identify the consultation, and then form a conclusion, having read a text that is so user unfriendly, and then participate in the process. But the truth of the matter is that still, and I think even more now than before, citizens are affected by EU regulation and EU legislation directly and increasingly more and more, yet they become more and more detached from the
Mhm.
decision-making process. So even if you think at a grander scale, which is not part of my expertise, but even if you think at political parties, citizens rarely influence parties within the
Mhm.
European Union because we vote uh, for our national representatives rather than a party in the EU. One could say that perhaps a way of changing this would be to introduce EU-wide parties and allocate our votes in a different way. But now we vote for our own people, whom we know on the basis of the national parties that form part of the EU party. We are we hear very little about what those parties will do in Europe or on European issues for our own countries, and we have very little role to play. It's a shame.
Because you mentioned that citizens are affected more directly by the EU regulations, and I'm thinking about the process that a lot of directives are actually replaced by a regulation, so with which is not usually required to transpose. And on the one hand, you can secure by that equal rights, equal conditions through whole Europe. On the other hand, it's true that the rights and duties, especially duties, are decided on supranational level. So is it better for better regulation? Because at least if you are using regulation, it's much easier to say, okay, this is something Brussels did. Of course, member states are taking part in the decision making, MEPs are taking part in decision making, we elected. But is it making clearer and better connection with between the citizens and EU? Do you think so?
See, I don't think it does. Let me explain. So we have one document, and it could be legislation or it could be regulation. So regulation is wider, as you know, than legislation. It could be a publicity campaign, it could be whatever. So let's say we have one initiative, legislative or not. And that initiative is basically introduced in order to achieve a result. And the result can be, for example, to increase the production of stevia within the EU. So what you do, you give incentives, you give subsidies to those who cultivate the plant. Now, that is fine from the point of view of a concrete aim and objective. It is very questionable that you will get there with just a single initiative that will address all the effectiveness prerequisites and requirements for each of the member states. After after enlargement, there's just too many of us, and that's nice. That's not a bad thing. But what it does for regulation is it calls upon different solutions that address the problem from the point of view of the specific jurisdiction. So you will regulate differently if, for example, in your own jurisdiction, you have too many stevia producers. Why would you give them a subsidy? You've got there. So the answer from the point of view of, say, Hellenia would be, no, I'm not going to comply with that, or I've already complied with that directive, so I don't need a regulation. I'm already there. I don't need to take any more steps. And that should be respected. It isn't within the EU right now. In another jurisdiction, you might have no production at all. And then when you look at it deeper, you might have no production because, for example, in Mihalia, you have the cultivation of tobacco, which is quite lucrative. So you need to find a way to replace tobacco with stevia, and that requires a localized initiative. So what I'm trying to say is that I find it very difficult to identify a scenario where the same objective can be served by the exact same regulatory initiative in, unfortunately, 27, 28 member states. And on that basis, I think we need to take that as our basis for a discussion and try and talk about directives. So I identify the EU as a goal setter, regulator. So you set your goal, and then you have to allow and you have to trust your national regulators to do their bit so that we can get where we want to go. And the question is, so if I want to enhance stevia production in the EU, is it enough for me to pass a piece of regulation to say from now on 10% of the production will be stevia? Do I achieve anything? So this whole concept that we legislate via regulation because that achieves homogeneity is completely false. It's flawed. It doesn't. We achieve homogeneity at the text level, but not at the real level. And regulation is about reality. It's not about legislative texts.
First, thank you that Michalia is producing tobacco. I noticed that. On the other hand, we end up with a question of subsidiarity, basically, if that's what you said. And how subsidiarity actually fits through the concept of better regulation?
That's a really good question again. I would say subsidiarity forces you as a regulator to think about the level of intervention that is required to achieve your aim. For me as an expert in regulation, it is not just about the boundaries of the EU and its competencies, which would be what a normal EU professor would talk about. For me, it's a different thing. It is about achieving my results. Can I achieve my results via a centralized solution? And competence is part of it. The answer is I can't if it's beyond the competence of the EU. But for me, focusing on regulation, there's another aspect to it as well. I don't want centralized solutions because for me as somebody pursuing a regulatory result, it is very doubtful, if not impossible, that the same result will be achieved within the different contexts of EU member states.
Mhm.
But see, it's not a matter. So the question, though, is this a matter of subsidiarity, or does it go even deeper? Is it a matter of mistrust to national regulators and national authorities? I mean, for me, it reflects quite a hierarchical rather than a collaborative relationship between the EU and member states. It's as if you have the EU as the regulator, who is sitting the naughty member states on a naughty step and asking them, have you done this? And because I know you're not capable of doing this, I will do it myself, hence the regulation. But that can no longer be the case because national regulators tend to be quite sophisticated. And at the end of the day, it is their awareness of the national eccentricities that can lead to effectiveness. And I'm reminding you that the quality or the definition of quality in better regulation and better legislation is effectiveness.
Mhm.
So how can you be effective in 27 different countries?
Especially in the same way, the same
But
regulatory
precisely,
tools are used.
precisely.
Uh,
So what should you be doing if you are a good regulator? You need to sit down and think and say, look, what I'm doing is I need to achieve a result. That is my EU regulatory goal. Now, how do I go about it? And that I need to impose with homogeneity. I agree with that. So I need a text that will give me that. I need to divide my regulatory burdens in two categories. One, where I give member states no discretion and I tell them this must be done. So I set my minimum standards that are absolutely necessary in order to achieve my result. And then I give them options.
mhm.
And that is why regulations at the EU level, in my view, are the least appropriate measures of better regulation.
Mhm. But if we are looking on the problem from the perspective of effectiveness,
Mm.
then one of the problems in EU regulatory structure is that a lot of things which are taking place on European level are actually not translated into national levels. So we are facing with very famous problem of gold plating. That, for example,
Mm-hmm.
something which is leading to liberalizing the areas at the national level. That national regulator is setting more burdensome conditions for
Mm-hmm.
example, for the businesses. And I would try to defend the EU that
Mm-hmm.
if there is a problem that you cannot reach the regulatory goal on the national level by directives, then you are probably on the other hand you are sacrificing
Yeah.
the subsidiarity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, but then I think you need also at the EU to figure out what exactly it is that you're trying to achieve.
Mhm.
Do you want to achieve better regulation at uh, uh, by means of like a standard legislative text that applies to everybody? Is this enough? Because if what you're trying to do is better regulation on paper, then that's fine. Then do what you're doing at the moment and just make sure that everybody has absolutely the same legislative text, irrespective of where you are in the EU.
Mhm.
If that is not enough, and I think it isn't, then you need to look much deeper and think, okay, so I have member states that um, will not deliver regulation to the point where I want them to deliver. Now, does that differ from the type of regulatory result that we get from member states now? Do we not have member states who may pass the document but not actually enforce it? Do we not implement it? Do we not get member states who do that, but then they amend the provision slightly in order to protect their own national interests? I think it's all part of the game. And I think we need to acknowledge and recognize that there's enough of us to almost consider a level of differentiation as a given. So for me, the challenge for the EU and better regulation now is not to attempt to impose the same standards to everybody, but to attempt to persuade everybody that achieving those standards is to their longer term benefit.
Mhm. I will move a little. Is a better regulation something which is for the European Commission, which is mostly connected with these policies, or is it something which is aimed for all EU institutions? Because I remember I told with one of the actually Czech representative to the EU, who told me that during the presidency he was chairing the negotiations of he was chairing a trilogue, and
Mm-hmm.
he willingly put more blur term in the legislative text to make a deal on both sides, so make a compromise, despite he even knew that in the future there will be problem with interpretation. So is it easier to make comprehensive legislation in the beginning, or is it better regulation something which is aiming even or mostly for the result. So actually the resolution, the legislation, not only the proposal.
No, you're absolutely right. It for me, and that is actually the way better regulation is addressed, even within the better regulation initiative of the EU. It is never about the start. It's always about um, constant evaluation,
Mhm.
um, with set criteria of effectiveness, but constant evaluation to ensure that results are being produced, monitoring. I mean, that is something that EU legislation had from the very beginning, and nobody quite understood why, why we would be accountable to the EU. But it is part of the EU's ethos for better regulation, which is now becoming a little bit more formal. And monitoring and reporting is one very successful way of ensuring that the results are being produced and that they're coming through. And sunset clauses, which again is another EU innovation, is there to ensure that if we fail to regulate, then we get rid of the attempt and we start from scratch. So I think it would be impossible to pretend that regulation and legislation ends at the point where a political agreement is reached. That's the start. That's the easy part.
Helen, can I intervene and ask for our listeners what is sunset clause?
Sorry, a sunset clause is a provision at the end of a legislative document which calls for post legislative scrutiny 3, normally, or 5 years after the passing of legislation, which gives the parliament the opportunity to decide whether the legislative instrument has worked, in which case they can continue, they can prolong its life, or if it has failed, in which case they will simply expire it
Mhm,
as a failed piece of legislation.
mhm. So basically, every regulatory act with sunset clause is actually some kind of experiment with people.
Yeah, yes, and but it is, and it cannot be in a different way, in the sense that we don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately. So you leave something and you throw something at the universe and you hope that it will give you the results that you want. But things might change. You may be wrong as a regulator. Things might change. Circumstances might change. And I think recent events in the world have shown that unbelievable things happen in the world. So better regulation is there to ensure that the results are produced irrespective of what happens with the world and the regulation.
Mhm. Okay, I think sunset clauses are something interesting, and especially for listeners from the Czech Republic, we
Mhm.
don't use them very often. I think we can find few examples. For example,
Mhm.
so-called Brexit law in the Czech Republic. And do you think that you can do proper evaluation of sunset clauses after period of COVID-19 pandemics and later with war in Ukraine? Is it possible? Because the playing field is completely changed.
Yeah. I mean, that is another difficult question, but yes, you can, because the idea of sunset clauses is to look at whether you have produced your results, i.e., have you had an increase of stevia production by 10% within a period of 10 years, irrespective of what happens in the world. So if the war in Ukraine, for example, has ensured that farmers do not change what they're cultivating, then this does not change the result of the sunset clause. It offers you as a regulator the opportunity to attribute any failure in the regulation to the war in Ukraine, and so ask for the parliament to continue extending, supporting the regulation, because hopefully the war will be finished pretty soon.
Mhm. Because if I'm looking at it from some political sciences perspective,
Mm-hmm.
then I would be, for example, if I'm a member of opposition in the parliament, I'm trying to prove that the government's regulation is failure. And on the other hand, as a government, if it's my regulations, I'm trying to keep it alive because otherwise I'm confirming that it's failure.
But that's how it should be, shouldn't it? I mean, that's the job of you as a member of the opposition or as a member of the government.
Mhm.
That's part of the governing game. Thank
Okay.
goodness we're not involved with it as professors, thank God.
Uh, Another political topic is very famous one in, one out policy. What is it?
What is it? This was within the context of better regulation. The European Commission felt that one way of making EU legislation less complex would be by limiting the number of pieces of legislation that come out from the EU on an annual basis. So, in order to lower the number of texts in the EU statute book, they introduced the obligation on member states to take away the same number, so one instrument, whenever they're introducing a new EU instrument. So you would go in and introduce the subsidy on stevia,
Mhm.
and at the same time, you would take out the subsidy on tobacco. Sorry.
Sorry. Sorry for people in Michalia.
Certainly not in Hellenia. So here we are. So that's the idea. The idea is that then in that case, we don't legislate as much, we legislate less, because that would help with the complexity of EU legislation. That's what one in, one out is. Of course, it is not just an EU initiative. It has been tried all over the world. In the UK, we, I think, reached the one in, two out, and there was discussion about one in, three out. But in the end, most jurisdictions abandoned it as an initiative for better legislation, and view it almost as an initiative for less legislation.
Mhm. Because the first thing I would do is just replace 3 paragraph regulation by, I don't know, 300 paragraph regulation. Because is it
Yeah.
literally one piece in, one piece out? Or is it
Unfor-
because it's
Unfortunately, yeah, no,
unfortunate? Okay.
I see what you're saying. You're spot on. Unfortunately, it is just mathematical.
Because I can keep a one in, one out policy while I'm just like expanding the regulatory burden because I will just make more obligations on businesses and ordinary citizens. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, I understood it
Precisely.
correctly.
Precisely. That's exactly what one should be thinking. You're absolutely right. It's a good idea in theory, and managing to take one in, one out, then at least forces you, well, it forces you to do, first of all, a review of what you've already got. That cannot be a
Mhm.
bad thing. So just try and figure out what is dead wood what would you not miss if you if you delete it from the statute book? So that's a good thing. It would also force you to look at any clashes or any supplementing documents. So it forces you to do a little bit like a small codification exercise. But as you rightly say, it very much depends how you do it. You may replace, as you say, one provision, so an EU Act with 10 articles, and replace it with a whole volume
Mhm.
that may regulate more in substance than the one before. That is one of the huge problems with one in, one out. But also, in my view, or the biggest problem in my view, because this you can really, I think you can address this by having an independent body that looks into the content and quality of your one in, one out. I mean, there certainly was such an office here in the UK. There's provisions like that for the EU. For me, the problem with one in, one out is that it creates the impression that this somehow improves the quality of legislation.
Mhm.
It doesn't. It can improve the volume. But if you have less legislation, which is more complex, more unapproachable, you're not in a better position than before. So the arithmetic, the mathematical, the quantitative nature of one in, one out does not contribute to legislative quality at all.
Mhm. I'm in my head. I'm just thinking because I think the Czech Republic is right now in the legislative deficit. We recently abolished like few hundreds of acts from 1920s, but
Wow.
I don't feel my life got better, I guess. But at least we find out that there was still some provision saying that the female professor at elementary school must be unmarried. Okay, I'm not sure whether somebody enforced it.
No, but that's precisely the objection. And the objection is that if we are to talk about better legislation, really, then we should be looking at the content of legislation rather
Mm.
than, easy things like metrical criteria. We actually need to go back, especially with the EU, and look at what it is we're producing, what it is that we're trying to achieve, what it is we're producing, and also how to involve our citizens in that process.
I know that in common law countries there is an institute of law commissions,
Mm-hmm.
some expert body who is which is going through the textbook and trying to select what is still what should be kept and what should be
Mm-hmm.
amended. Can you expand it for it? Because in continental legal systems, that's something which is not well known.
So the law commission, and there are different law
Mhm.
commissions in different jurisdictions that do different things. So, but generalizing, what the law commission is there to do is to ensure currency of the legislation so that it is current. And how does it do that? It does it via two specific ways. One is by looking at areas, substantive areas of law that require modernization. So, for example, if you have still legislation on, and forgive the word, but it is what it was in the UK, bastard children, then
Mhm.
obviously this is not something that you can allow. So the Law Commission will come in, look at the different provisions and modernize them to align them with the modern ethos of the jurisdiction. So it does that, but it also has the technical task of law revision. And law revision is where you look at legislation and you do exactly what you've said. You just get rid of whatever is no longer in use, and also resolve any clashes. So law revision would not change the law from what it is, but it will uh, clear the statute book and
Mhm.
ensure that there is understandability in the legislation. For example, there was the initiative here in the UK on from the Law Commission where they looked at the East India Company
Mm-hmm.
which was
Okay.
a couple of centuries, which was a few years ago. And although East India Company no longer exists, there were still provisions in there that made sense and needed to be retained. So that was a project. Another project, arguably, was the tax law rewrite project, where they looked at legislation related to individual taxation and made it more user-friendly, tried to resolve some clashes. There is one example there where a specific provision introduced an unclear phrase, and they tried to make it clearer. But there was just one case from the courts that went one way, and just one case from the courts that went the other way.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Law Commission did was they just annotated to say, this is unclear, this is the position of the one case, and this is the provision of another. So it is quite a technical intervention to legislation, the Law Commission.
Mm-hmm. So the Law Commission is actually not making policy changes, but only recommending to create more comprehensive legal texts.
Yes, there are circumstances where, for the purposes of modernization, the Law Commission would make policy recommendations. And more often than not, they will have that along with a draft for the government. But the uptake of these sort of initiatives is very, very low in most law commissions. So it would be around, what, 25%, more or less. So it's not a very prominent task.
Okay. Do you think that EU should have something like a legal commission?
We had the SLIM initiative. I don't know if you remember that, the Simpler Legislation for the Internal Market initiative, which did precisely that. They looked at legislation on the internal market and they tried to simplify it. That's exactly what a law commission would do. Would I want to invest money, especially now where money is so scarce, with an EU law commission? No, I wouldn't. What I would do instead is I would train, well, I would first introduce professional drafters at the law commission so that they can do the job properly rather than from the point of view of language only, for example. And part of that training would be to really resolve the issues that a law commission would resolve. So if you're introducing a new piece of EU legislation, then what do you do with what's happening behind it?
Okay, last question. Thank you, Helen. What would you wish EU legal code? I know that you are currently working in the UK, but you are still very EU connected.
Yes. And one does not negate the other. There's a lot of us in the UK that are very active in the EU, and I think that should not and will not stop. So here we are. So what is my wish? My wish is that better regulation would look at legislation as a product, as a text, that the Commission undertakes a holistic reform of its legislative strategy. It would start thinking about how we can make sure that EU legislation serves as a direct channel of communication between the EU and its citizens. And I think this is a role for the Parliament, not for the Commission. I think it's a right for all of us who are EU citizens to receive, first of all, to participate in decision-making, but also to receive clear legislation and accessible legislation as part of democracy, part of the rule of law. So it's our right to get that. And I think the defender of citizens' rights is the Parliament. So I want the Parliament to start a working group for better regulation. I want them to be quite radical. I don't think that it serves the EU at this point to think about treaty reform. I think in a time of instability in the world, and there's Ukraine, there's Gaza, there's all sorts of places where things are not what we would hope them to be. So in such a time of instability, the EU must be stable, but try and consider radical ideas like, for example, a reform of the drafting style of EU instruments. See whether we as proud technocrats can actually assist to make better legislation better. give us a shot. Do the same that they did with COVID. COVID was resolved by means of specialists, doctors. So when it comes to regulation and legislation, it's us, the legal academic, so the legal, political science, economics, and so forth, academics that can assist. Hear us, change things. Don't be afraid. Stop, I think, stop closing yourselves within a Brussels bubble, which does not get what is happening on the ground with EU citizens. Because if that direct communication starts, then that gives the EU the unique opportunity to silence populist voices. So perhaps even stop another Brexit if that is in the cards, I don't know, but at least discuss the narrative of the EU directly with EU citizens, forge a relationship of trust and loyalty of EU citizens to the EU as an ideal and as an organization, and ultimately contribute to sustainable integration. I mean, what we're trying to achieve as, those of us who are Europhiles is a longer life and for the EU and a better life for citizens. Well, that is one way of achieving that. That would be my wish. So if I had a magic wand, I would change the mentality of EU regulators.
I have so many questions now, and I think we'll have to do another episode together.
Perfect.
Our guest was amazing, Helen Xanthaki, lawmaking expert and professor in regulatory law and all related aspects of it. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. Thanks, Michal. Thanks for having me.
Cink, 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 dostali jste se na konec epizody a moc děkujeme za to, že jste nás poslouchali až do konce.
Určitě nám dejte like, určitě nás odebírejte a budeme se na vás těšit při příštím díle.
A pokud se vám díl líbil, pošlete nám zpětnou vazbu, pošlete nám to na e-mail z evropy@perfecuni.cz, pošlete to svým známým, hoďte si to do storíčka na Instagramu, cokoliv, budeme za to moc rádi, jak se to dostane co k největšímu množství lidí, které by to mohlo zajímat.
Děkujeme, mějte se hezky.